The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Minneapolis Municipal Court, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Judge William Harrison sat straight-backed in his large black leather chair, his reading glasses perched low on his nose as he shuffled through the stack of cases before him. At 62 years old, with graying hair and deep wrinkles around his eyes, he had spent over 2 decades behind this bench. It was a Tuesday morning, and the courtroom buzzed with the usual activity. The clerk, Mrs. Peterson, moved efficiently between her desk and the judge's bench, organizing papers and whispering updates about the day's schedule. The ancient wall clock ticked steadily, marking time as one case after another came before the judge. Next case, Judge Harrison called out, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came from years of practice. He didn't bother looking up from his papers as the next person approached the podium. The sound of confident heels clicking against the floor echoed through the courtroom. Dr. Kimberly Washington stood before him, her posture perfect and her appearance immaculate, in a tailored navy blue suit. At 38, she had already achieved more than most people do in a lifetime, though none of this was apparent to the judge, who still hadn't lifted his eyes. Her natural hair was styled professionally, and she carried a leather briefcase that contained important documents for a meeting she would be leading later that day. "Parking violation, Your Honor," the clerk announced, passing another file to Judge Harrison. The judge finally glanced up, his eyes barely registering the woman standing before him. His expression remained impassive, the same look he had worn all morning while processing what he considered to be mundane cases. "Name?" he asked, his tone carrying a hint of boredom. "Dr. Kimberly Washington," she replied clearly, her voice steady and professional. Judge Harrison's pen paused briefly at the title before continuing to write. "Says here you parked in a metered spot on Sater Street for 3 hours without paying. Is this correct?" He spoke in the same monotonous tone he had used for the past dozen cases. "Your Honor, if I may explain," Dr. Washington began, her voice calm and measured. "It's a simple yes or no question, Ms. Washington." Judge Harrison interrupted, deliberately ignoring her professional title. He looked at her with slight annoyance, the way he often did when people tried to offer explanations instead of direct answers. "Yes, Your Honor, but the meter was—" "The question has been answered," he cut her off again, making a short notation in his file. The morning sun caught his wedding ring as he wrote, throwing off a brief glint of light. "This is your second parking violation this year." In the gallery, a few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A young law intern scribbled notes furiously, her eyes darting between the judge and Dr. Washington. The court officer standing by the door maintained his neutral expression, though his eyes showed a flicker of recognition when Dr. Washington had stated her name. Dr. Washington stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her. The only sign of her growing frustration was a slight tightening around her eyes. She had dealt with similar treatment before, but her position had taught her the value of patience and composure. "Given that this is your second offense," Judge Harrison continued, his voice carrying the finality of someone who had already made up his mind, "I'm imposing a fine of $500. This should serve as a reminder to follow parking regulations properly." He barely looked at her as he spoke, already reaching for the next file. The amount was excessive for a parking violation, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. A few whispers rippled through the audience, quickly silenced by a sharp look from the court officer. "Your Honor, I would like to submit evidence that the meter was malfunctioning," Dr. Washington said, opening her briefcase. Judge Harrison sighed heavily, the kind of sigh that suggested he was dealing with something beneath his time and patience. "The fine stands, Ms. Washington. You can submit your payment to the clerk. Next case." The last words came out sharper than his usual tone. Dr. Washington closed her briefcase slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. She nodded once, straightened her jacket, and turned to leave the courtroom. As she walked out, her heels echoing on the floor once again, she pulled out her phone to check the time. Her presentation to the State Judicial Reform Commission was in 4 hours, and she had much to prepare. Behind her, Judge Harrison had already moved on to the next case, unaware that his morning's behavior would soon come back to challenge everything he thought he knew about justice and prejudice. Dr. Washington approached the court clerk's desk, her face a mask of composure despite the unfair treatment she had just experienced. Mrs. Peterson, the clerk, looked up at her with sympathetic eyes as she prepared to process the excessive fine. The morning light now streamed fully through the windows, illuminating the particles of dust floating in the air of the old courthouse. $500. Judge Harrison's voice boomed from the bench, interrupting Mrs. Peterson as she began typing. And make sure it's processed today. His tone carried an edge that hadn't been present with other cases that morning. He shuffled more papers on his desk, deliberately avoiding looking in Dr. Washington's direction. The clerk's fingers hesitated over her keyboard. In her 15 years working at the courthouse, Mrs. Peterson had rarely seen such a steep fine for a simple parking violation. She glanced quickly at Dr. Washington, then back at her computer screen. "Will you be paying by card or check today?" she asked softly. Dr. Washington reached into her briefcase and pulled out her wallet. The leather was soft and worn, containing not just her credit cards but also her State Judicial Reform Commission identification card, something that would have made Judge Harrison think twice about his actions. But she didn't display it. Instead, she pulled out her credit card silently. As Mrs. Peterson processed the payment, another case was being heard in the background. A young white man, probably in his mid-20s, stood before Judge Harrison for the exact same violation, a parking meter infraction. "Given that this is your first offense," Judge Harrison's voice carried across the room, "I'll reduce the fine to $100. Just be more careful next time, son." The contrast in treatment was stark and obvious to everyone in the courtroom. Dr. Washington's fingers tightened slightly around her credit card, but her expression remained neutral. She had spent years documenting exactly this type of discriminatory behavior for her research. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now experiencing it firsthand, just hours before her presentation on judicial reform. "I have your receipt, Dr. Washington," Mrs. Peterson said, her voice barely above a whisper. She slid the paper across the desk, adding quietly, "This isn't right. I've never seen a first fine this high, let alone a second one." "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson," Dr. Washington replied, carefully folding the receipt and placing it in her briefcase. She would add it to her growing collection of documentation on judicial disparities. "Would you happen to have a copy of today's court records?" The clerk looked around cautiously before pulling out an additional form. "Here's the docket list. It shows all of today's fines and sentences." Her eyes met Dr. Washington's briefly, conveying an understanding of why this information might be important. As Dr. Washington reviewed the document, her trained eye quickly noted the patterns. White defendants consistently received lower fines or warnings, while minorities faced harsher penalties for identical violations. It was textbook discriminatory practice, laid out in black and white on official court documents. The young law intern who had been taking notes earlier approached Dr. Washington cautiously. "Dr. Washington?" she whispered, glancing nervously at Judge Harrison, who was still presiding over cases. "I've been tracking the fines all morning for my law school thesis on judicial bias. Would you be willing to look at my data?" Before Dr. Washington could respond, Judge Harrison's voice cut through their conversation. "If you're done with your business here, please exit the courtroom. We have other cases to process." His tone was sharp, dismissive. Dr. Washington nodded to the intern, slipping her a business card discreetly. She gathered her belongings and walked toward the exit, her head held high. The court officer opened the door for her, offering a subtle nod of respect. In the hallway, Dr. Washington finally allowed herself a moment to process what had happened. She checked her watch. It was 10:45 a.m. Her keynote speech at the State Judicial Reform Commission was scheduled for 2:00 p.m., where she would be presenting to a room full of judicial officials about the very behavior she had just experienced. Opening her phone's calendar, she saw the reminder for her presentation. Addressing Systemic Bias in the Judicial System, Minneapolis Convention Center, Main Hall. Below it was a note listing the attendees, including all municipal court judges who were required to attend this mandatory training session. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth as she imagined Judge Harrison's face when he would see her again, this time standing at the podium as the head of the commission that oversees judicial conduct reform. But for now, she had a presentation to prepare, and this morning's experience had just given her the perfect opening example. The Minneapolis Convention Center buzzed with activity as judges and legal officials filed into the main hall for the mandatory judicial reform session. Judge Harrison adjusted his tie as he walked through the grand doors, nodding to a few familiar faces. He chose a seat in the middle row, not too close to the front to draw attention, but not so far back as to appear disinterested. "Quite a turnout today," remarked Judge Stevens, an older colleague who settled into the chair beside him. The hall was indeed packed, with over 200 legal professionals filling the rows of comfortable seats. The stage at the front held a podium, flanked by large screens showing the State Judicial Reform Commission's logo. Judge Harrison pulled out his phone to check his emails, barely paying attention to the murmuring crowd around him. His morning session in court felt like a distant memory now, just another day of processing cases and maintaining order. The commission's chairman approached the podium, tapping the microphone to get everyone's attention. "Distinguished members of the judicial community," the chairman began, his voice echoing through the hall. "It gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. She holds a doctorate in criminal justice from Harvard University, has published groundbreaking research on judicial bias, and was recently appointed as the head of our State Judicial Reform Commission." Judge Harrison put his phone away, stifling a yawn. These mandatory sessions were always the same, someone lecturing them about being more sensitive, more aware. He straightened his glasses, preparing himself for another boring presentation. "Please welcome Dr. Kimberly Washington." The sound of heels clicking against the stage floor echoed through the hall. Judge Harrison's body went rigid, his face straining of color as he recognized the woman approaching the podium. It was the same person he had found just hours ago, the woman he had repeatedly interrupted and dismissed. Dr. Washington stood at the podium, commanding the room with her presence. She wore the same navy blue suit from the morning, but now her State Judicial Reform Commission badge hung prominently around her neck. Her eyes swept across the audience, pausing briefly when they met Judge Harrison's shocked gaze. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice clear and authoritative. "Today, we're going to discuss something that happened in one of our courtrooms this very morning." Judge Harrison's collar suddenly felt too tight. He could feel sweat forming on his forehead as she clicked to the first slide. There, displayed on both massive screens, was a graph showing the disparity in fines handed out that morning, with timestamps and case numbers clearly visible. At 9:45 a.m. today, Dr. Washington continued. A black female defendant was fined $500 for a parking meter violation. 20 minutes later, a white male defendant with the same violation received a $100 fine. She didn't need to mention names. The data spoke for itself. Heads turned in Judge Harrison's direction. Some of his colleagues had already made the connection, having heard about the morning's excessive fine through courthouse gossip. Judge Stevens shifted uncomfortably in his seat beside him. Dr. Washington clicked to the next slide, which showed a broader pattern of similar disparities across the state. "This isn't about one incident or one judge," she said diplomatically, though her eyes briefly met Judge Harrison's again. "This is about a system that allows these disparities to persist." Judge Harrison wanted to disappear into his chair. His mind raced back to every word he had spoken that morning, every dismissive gesture, every interruption. Each memory now felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. The woman he had treated with such casual disdain was not only a highly qualified professional, but also his superior in matters of judicial conduct. Over the next 2 hours, Dr. Washington continued. "We'll examine the data, discuss the psychological concept of implicit bias, and most importantly, develop concrete strategies for change." The presentation continued with clinical precision, each slide revealing patterns that Judge Harrison had never noticed, or perhaps had chosen not to notice, in his own courtroom. Dr. Washington never once singled him out or mentioned their morning encounter, but her examples hit uncomfortably close to home. As she spoke about the importance of listening to all defendants equally, Judge Harrison remembered cutting off her attempts to explain about the malfunctioning meter. When she discussed the impact of dismissive language, he recalled how he had repeatedly ignored her professional title. By the session's halfway point, Judge Harrison had filled several pages of his notepad with hastily scribbled notes. His hands were slightly shaky, and his usual judicial confidence had crumbled into something that felt remarkably like shame. He realized that this afternoon's presentation wasn't just another mandatory training session. It was a powerful lesson in humility, delivered by the very person he had wronged. Dr. Washington moved through her presentation with calm precision, each slide revealing more compelling evidence of systemic bias in the judicial system. The afternoon light filtered through the convention center's high windows, casting long shadows across the assembled judges and legal officials. Judge Harrison remained frozen in his seat, his pen hovering over his notepad. "Let's examine case study 17," Dr. Washington announced, clicking to a new slide. "This morning, in one of our Minneapolis courtrooms, we witnessed a perfect example of how implicit bias affects decision-making." She pulled up two identical parking citations, displayed side by side on the large screens. Judge Harrison's heart pounded as he recognized his own handwriting on both documents. The only differences between the cases were the defendants' names and the vastly different fines he had imposed. Several heads turned in his direction again, but he kept his eyes fixed on the screen. "Notice the language used in each interaction," Dr. Washington continued, playing audio clips from the courtroom's recording system. The first clip captured his dismissive tone with her, while the second showcased his friendly, almost paternal interaction with the young white defendant. The contrast was stark and undeniable. A young prosecutor raised her hand. "Dr. Washington, what measures can we implement to prevent such disparities in sentencing?" Dr. Washington smiled, her expression professional and engaging. "An excellent question. This brings us to our next section on accountability measures." She clicked to a new slide showing the comprehensive reform proposal. The Commission has developed a new system for tracking judicial decisions, which will flag patterns of disparity for immediate review. Judge Harrison scribbled frantically in his notepad, his handwriting barely legible as he documented every point. Around him, other judges were doing the same, though many kept glancing in his direction. His earlier arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a growing understanding of his own biases. "Starting next month," Dr. Washington announced, "all judicial officials will participate in monthly bias recognition workshops." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room. "These sessions will include role reversal exercises and data analysis of our own courtroom decisions." The room buzzed with quiet discussion. Judge Stevens leaned over to Harrison, whispering, "Isn't that the woman from your courtroom this morning?" Harrison could only manage a slight nod, his mouth dry. Dr. Washington continued her presentation, sharing statistics that showed how small biases accumulated into significant disparities over time. She presented research from various states, demonstrating that the problem wasn't isolated to Minneapolis. Her delivery remained professional and focused on solutions rather than blame. "Many of you might be wondering why we're implementing these changes now," she said, her voice carrying authority and purpose. "The answer is simple. Justice delayed is justice denied. We cannot wait for the perfect moment to address these issues." As she spoke about the importance of professional courtesy and equal treatment, Judge Harrison remembered how he had repeatedly referred to her as Ms., despite her clearly stated title. Each example she presented seemed to directly reference his behavior from that morning, though she never once singled him out. The presentation moved into its final segment, focusing on practical steps for change. Dr. Washington outlined new guidelines for standardizing fines and sentences, ensuring that similar offenses received similar treatment regardless of the defendant's background. "Remember," she emphasized, pulling up a powerful closing slide, "every person who stands before you deserves to be heard. Their appearance, background, or manner of speech should not influence the administration of justice." Judge Harrison felt the weight of every word. He thought about how quickly he had dismissed Dr. Washington's attempt to explain about the malfunctioning meter, how he had barely looked at her while passing judgment. The irony of his behavior towards someone who held such authority in judicial reform was not lost on him. As Dr. Washington concluded her presentation, the audience rose for a standing ovation. Judge Harrison stood too, his applause genuine but his expression troubled. He watched as several colleagues approached the podium to speak with her, noting how she greeted each one with the same professional courtesy he had failed to show her. The afternoon session was drawing to a close, but Judge Harrison remained in his seat, still taking notes. He knew he had witnessed not just a presentation, but a masterclass in dignity and professionalism. Dr. Washington had turned his own biased behavior into a teaching moment without once resorting to personal attacks or public humiliation. As the crowd began to disperse, he gathered his courage. He knew he needed to speak with her, to acknowledge his behavior and apologize. But as he watched her surrounded by admiring colleagues, he realized that this conversation would have to wait for a more appropriate moment. Later that evening, Judge Harrison sat alone in his chambers, the room dimly lit by his desk lamp. The clock on the wall showed 7:30 p.m., long after most court employees had gone home. His tie hung loose around his neck as he reached for the remote control to his courtroom's recording system. With slightly trembling fingers, he pressed play. The screen flickered to life, showing the morning's proceedings. He watched himself on the monitor, seeing his behavior through new eyes after Dr. Washington's afternoon presentation. The first few cases moved quickly, routine traffic violations and minor offenses. Then Dr. Washington appeared on screen. Judge Harrison leaned forward, turning up the volume. He watched himself barely look up as she approached the podium, noticed how he cut her off mid-sentence multiple times. The recording caught everything: his dismissive tone, his deliberate ignorance of her professional title, the way he rushed through her case without allowing proper explanation. "Good Lord," he muttered to himself, running a hand over his tired face. He paused the video and rewound it, this time paying attention to Dr. Washington's composed demeanor despite his rudeness. Even then, she had maintained her professional dignity, the same dignity she showed during her afternoon presentation. He pulled out the court records for the day, spreading them across his desk. The evidence was damning. Case after case showed a clear pattern: lower fines for white defendants, higher fines for minorities. He had never noticed it before, or perhaps he had chosen not to notice. The numbers didn't lie. A gentle knock at his door startled him. Mrs. Peterson, the court clerk, stood in the doorway with a concerned expression. "Judge Harrison, I thought you might still be here." She hesitated before continuing. "I brought you something you should see." She placed a folder on his desk, statistics from the past 6 months of his courtroom proceedings. The patterns were even more obvious in the long-term data. His hands shook slightly as he flipped through the pages. "I've been keeping track," Mrs. Peterson said quietly. "I thought someday someone might ask for this information." She had worked with him for over a decade, watching these patterns develop day after day. Judge Harrison slumped in his chair, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. "How did I not see this?" he asked, more to himself than to Mrs. Peterson. The question hung heavy in the air. He turned back to the video screen, fast-forwarding to the case immediately after Dr. Washington's. The young white man with the same parking violation received a dramatically lower fine and a friendly warning. Watching it now, Judge Harrison could hardly recognize himself in the smiling, lenient judge on the screen. Mrs. Peterson stood quietly by the door. "Judge Harrison," she said gently, "maybe this is an opportunity. Dr. Washington's presentation today, it wasn't just about pointing fingers. It was about making changes." He nodded slowly, rewinding the footage again. This time, he noticed something else: the faces in the gallery during Dr. Washington's case. The subtle looks of disappointment, the uncomfortable shifting in seats, the way the young law intern had scribbled furiously in her notebook. Everyone had seen what he had been blind to. Taking out a legal pad, Judge Harrison began making notes. He wrote down every instance of bias he could identify in his behavior, every moment where he could have, should have, done better. The list grew longer as the evening wore on. Mrs. Peterson brought him a cup of coffee before leaving for the night. "It's never too late to change, Your Honor," she said kindly, closing the door behind her. Alone again, Judge Harrison pulled out his copy of Dr. Washington's presentation materials. He began reading through them carefully, no longer as a required exercise but as a necessary step toward personal change. Her words from the afternoon echoed in his mind. "Justice is not about power, but about equality." The night deepened outside his window as he continued his self-examination. He reviewed more cases, took more notes, and gradually began to understand the full scope of his biased behavior. This wasn't just about one incident with Dr. Washington. It was about countless defendants who had stood before him, seeking justice, and received prejudice instead. As midnight approached, Judge Harrison finally turned off the recording system and gathered his things. He had made a decision. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow would be the first day of a new approach to justice in his courtroom. But first, he knew he owed Dr. Washington an apology, not just for his treatment of her, but for everything she represented that he had failed to see. The next morning, Judge Harrison arrived at the courthouse an hour earlier than usual. The hallways were still quiet, with only the cleaning staff moving about as he made his way to his courtroom. He carried a new notebook under his arm, its pages filled with notes from his late-night reflection. Mrs. Peterson looked up in surprise when he appeared at her desk. "Good morning, Your Honor. You're here early." She noticed something different about him. His usual stern expression had been replaced by one of thoughtful determination. "Mrs. Peterson, I need your help," he said, placing his notebook on her desk. "I want to review every case scheduled for today before we begin, and I'd like to implement some immediate changes to our procedures." Over the next hour, they worked together to establish new protocols. Every fine would be documented with clear justification. Every defendant would be given adequate time to explain their situation. Most importantly, he asked Mrs. Peterson to track any patterns in his decisions and alert him if she noticed disparities. As the morning session began, the regular crowd of lawyers, defendants, and observers filtered into the courtroom. The first case involved a young Hispanic woman with a speeding ticket. Judge Harrison caught himself about to rush through the case and stopped. "Please," he said, his voice notably gentler than usual, "tell me the circumstances of this incident." He listened carefully as she explained about her sick child in the back seat and the urgent need to reach the hospital. In the past, he might have dismissed her story. Today, he verified her hospital visit and reduced the fine accordingly. Case after case, the change in Judge Harrison's approach was evident. The court officers exchanged surprised glances. The attorneys who regularly appeared before him noticed how he made eye contact with each defendant, how he carefully considered their words before making decisions. During the lunch break, the young law intern from the previous day approached his bench. "Your Honor," she said hesitantly, "I noticed you're handling cases differently today." She held up her notebook, showing how she had documented the morning's proceedings. Judge Harrison nodded. "Yes, I am, and I'd be interested in seeing your observations, if you're willing to share them." The intern's face lit up as she showed him her detailed notes comparing his previous patterns with today's cases. In the afternoon session, a case similar to Dr. Washington's came up. Another parking meter violation. Judge Harrison listened carefully to the defendant's explanation, checked the evidence thoroughly, and issued a fair fine based solely on the circumstances, not the person's appearance or background. Word spread quickly through the courthouse about the change in courtroom 302. Other judges stopped by to observe. Some seemed uncomfortable with the slower pace of proceedings, but none could deny the positive impact on the atmosphere in the courtroom. At the end of the day, Judge Harrison received an email from the State Judicial Reform Commission. They had noticed the changes in his courtroom procedures and wanted to use his transformation as a case study for other judges. His first instinct was to decline, to hide from his past mistakes. But then he remembered Dr. Washington's words about accountability and growth. He drafted a careful reply, accepting their request and offering to share his insights about recognizing and addressing unconscious bias. As he typed, he realized that true change meant not just acknowledging past mistakes, but using them to help others improve. Before leaving for the day, he called a meeting with his entire courtroom staff, the bailiffs, clerks, and court reporters. "I owe all of you an apology," he began. "I've allowed bias to affect my judgments, and you've had to witness it day after day. That changes now." He shared his new protocols with them and asked for their help in maintaining fairness in his courtroom. The staff, many of whom had worked with him for years, responded with enthusiasm and relief. As he gathered his things to leave, Mrs. Peterson handed him one last document, the day's statistics. The numbers showed consistent fines across all demographics, equal time given to each case, and fair outcomes based on circumstances rather than appearance. "It's a good start, Your Honor," she said with a smile. Judge Harrison nodded, tucking the report into his briefcase. He knew one day of changed behavior didn't erase years of bias, but it was a beginning. As he walked out of the courthouse, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time in his career, he felt truly ready to serve justice equally to all. After 2 weeks of implementing his new courtroom procedures, Judge Harrison finally gathered the courage to request a meeting with Dr. Washington. He sat in his office, staring at the email he had drafted and rewritten multiple times. Finally, with a deep breath, he pressed send. Her response came within an hour. "Judge Harrison, I can meet you tomorrow at 2 p.m. in my office at the State Judicial Reform Commission." The message was professional and brief, giving no hint of her feelings about the meeting. The next day, Judge Harrison stood outside the commission's building, 15 minutes early. The modern glass structure reflected the afternoon sun, making him squint as he looked up at it. He straightened his tie one last time before entering. The receptionist guided him to Dr. Washington's office on the 10th floor. The space was impressive, walls lined with law books, degrees, and awards. Through the large windows, the city spread out below, reminding him of how small his courtroom was in the greater scheme of things. Dr. Washington rose from behind her desk as he entered. Judge Harrison, she greeted him professionally, gesturing to a chair. She wore a crimson blazer today, her presence just as commanding as it had been during her presentation. Dr. Washington, he began, his voice slightly unsteady. I've spent the past 2 weeks reflecting on my behavior in court that day, and, he paused, gathering his thoughts. I owe you more than just an apology. I owe you an acknowledgement of the systemic problems my actions represented. She sat quietly, listening as he continued. From her desk, he could see the parking ticket receipt from that day, framed and hanging on her wall, a reminder of why their work mattered. I brought something to show you, he said, pulling out 2 weeks' worth of courtroom statistics. After your presentation, I implemented new procedures. Every case, every fine, every decision documented and justified. He placed the papers on her desk. Dr. Washington reviewed the documents carefully. The numbers showed dramatic changes. Consistent fines across all demographics, equal time allocated to each case, and detailed documentation of every decision. This is impressive, Judge Harrison, she said finally, looking up from the papers. But what prompted these changes? Was it discovering my position, or truly understanding the impact of biased decisions? The question hung in the air. Judge Harrison shifted in his chair, then decided complete honesty was the only acceptable answer. Initially, it was shame, he admitted. Shame at how I treated you, at being exposed. But as I reviewed my cases, as I really listened to defendants these past weeks, it became about justice. Real justice. Dr. Washington nodded slowly. She stood and walked to her window, looking out over the city. You know, Judge Harrison, that parking ticket wasn't my first experience with judicial bias. I've spent years studying these patterns, experiencing them firsthand. That's why I chose this field. She turned back to face him. Your courtroom data shows promising changes, but sustainable change requires more than 2 weeks of good behavior. What's your long-term plan? Judge Harrison straightened in his chair. I volunteered to share my experience with other judges. The commission approved my request to start a peer review program in my courthouse. And he hesitated, then continued. I'd like your guidance on implementing more comprehensive reforms. A slight smile appeared on Dr. Washington's face, the first since he'd entered her office. She returned to her desk and pulled out a folder. I have some ideas about that, she said, opening it to reveal a detailed proposal for judicial reform programs. For the next hour, they discussed practical steps for change. Dr. Washington shared insights from her research, while Judge Harrison offered perspectives from his years on the bench. Their conversation shifted from an apology to a collaboration. As their meeting drew to a close, Dr. Washington stood. Judge Harrison, your apology is accepted, but more importantly, your actions show genuine commitment to change. That's what matters most. He rose to leave, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. At the door, he turned back. Dr. Washington, thank you, not just for accepting my apology, but for turning my mistake into an opportunity for real change. She nodded, then added with a slight smile, and Judge Harrison, the parking meter really was broken that day. He left her office understanding that this conversation wasn't an ending, but a beginning. The real work of transformation, both personal and systemic, was still ahead. But for the first time, he felt truly equipped and motivated to be part of the solution, not the problem. 6 months had passed since Judge Harrison's meeting with Dr. Washington. The Minneapolis courthouse had transformed in ways few could have predicted. On this particular morning, a group of judges from across the state gathered in courtroom 302 to observe what had become known as the Harrison Protocol in action. Judge Harrison, now sporting a bit more gray in his hair, sat at his bench with a different air about him. Gone was the stern, dismissive demeanor that had once characterized his courtroom. Instead, he carried himself with a mindful presence, treating each case with careful consideration. Dr. Washington stood at the back of the courtroom, clipboard in hand, conducting her quarterly review. The changes were evident in every detail: clear signage in multiple languages explaining court procedures, a new digital system tracking judicial decisions for bias patterns, and most importantly, a transformed atmosphere of respect and equality. Case number 247 called out Mrs. Peterson, who now served as both clerk and program coordinator for the new judicial training initiative. A young mother approached the podium, her toddler balanced on her hip. Judge Harrison smiled gently. "Good morning," he said, making eye contact. "Please, take your time explaining your situation." The observing judges noted how he leaned forward slightly, showing he was actively listening. During the lunch break, Dr. Washington led a discussion session in the courthouse conference room. Judge Harrison sat among his peers, no longer embarrassed by his past but eager to share his learning experience. 6 months ago, he addressed the group. "I was part of the problem. Today, our courthouse data shows a 90% reduction in demographic-based sentencing disparities. This isn't just about numbers, it's about real people getting real justice." Dr. Washington stepped forward, displaying the latest statistics on the screen. "Judge Harrison's courtroom has become our model for institutional change," she explained. "The program we developed together is now being implemented in courthouses across 3 states. The presentation included video clips comparing before and after courtroom interactions. Judge Harrison watched his old self on screen without flinching. Those moments now served as powerful teaching tools for other judges. Later that afternoon, a special ceremony was held in the courthouse lobby. The state Supreme Court Chief Justice had come to announce the official adoption of the Harrison-Washington Judicial Reform Initiative statewide. Reporters gathered as Dr. Washington and Judge Harrison stood together at the podium. "This program proves that change is possible," Dr. Washington addressed the crowd. "It shows that when we acknowledge our biases and actively work to correct them, we create a better justice system for everyone." Judge Harrison stepped up next. "6 months ago, I imposed an unfair fine on Dr. Washington without giving her a chance to speak. Today, we stand together, having turned that moment of injustice into a catalyst for systematic change." The crowd included many familiar faces: the young law intern, now running the courthouse's bias monitoring program, Mrs. Peterson, training clerks from other districts, and countless defendants who had experienced the difference in Judge Harrison's reformed courtroom. After the ceremony, Dr. Washington and Judge Harrison walked through the courthouse halls, discussing future plans. They stopped at the frame hanging outside courtroom 302, that original parking ticket receipt, now displayed alongside the first page of their reform initiative. "You know," Dr. Washington said, "that broken parking meter ended up fixing something much bigger than we expected." Judge Harrison nodded, remembering how differently things might have turned out if he hadn't confronted his own biases. "It's not just about changing procedures," he replied. "It's about changing hearts and minds, one decision at a time." As they reached the courthouse steps, they could see a group of new judges arriving for tomorrow's training session. The sun was setting over Minneapolis, casting long shadows across the Justice Building's facade. "Ready for another day of training tomorrow?" Dr. Washington asked, checking her schedule on her phone. "Always," Judge Harrison replied with a smile. "Every new judge we train means thousands more people will receive fair treatment in court." They parted ways as evening fell, each heading home after another productive day. The courthouse stood quiet now, but ready for tomorrow's cases that would be heard with new ears and judged with new eyes, thanks to one parking ticket that had changed everything. On his desk, Judge Harrison left his daily reminder note, the same words he'd written every morning for 6 months. "Listen first, judge second." Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, and new opportunities to prove that justice, when truly blind to bias, could work for everyone.